ready to go?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on my radar.
You're all set.
Okay, call this meeting to order, the December 16th meeting of the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan Ad Hoc Committee. Rolls right off your tongue. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Dan.
So let's see, first item is call to order, Chris.
Yep, so the recording notice. This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the Town of Barnstable's Government Access Channel in accordance with Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 30A, Section 20. The chair must inquire whether anyone else is recording this meeting, and if so, to please make their presence known. Will please let their presence be known to Scott if you're recording. Lovely. Sorry, doing this two things at a time. And then you want me to just go into roll call?
Sure.
All right, and we're gonna do a roll call. Luis O'Neill.
Here.
Glenn Snell.
Here.
Butch Roberts. Previously told us he wasn't gonna be here. Tom Cambereri. Rob O'Leary. C. Crocker.
Here.
Brian Hughes.
Here.
Scott Horsley.
Here.
Paul Neary. Gordon Starr, we knew wasn't gonna be here. And Chris Clark, I just saw walk in. Hi, Chris. All right, and with Chris getting here, that actually brings us up to quorum.
Okay. And I see we have a couple of guests here this evening. You guys care to introduce yourselves?
John Lynch, Centerville. Bruce Walton, and we have a WTS task force. And we also have a home in Centerville.
Awesome. Okay, so has anybody had a chance to look at the minutes and want to make a move to approve or edit?
I move to approve.
Second.
Chris, second. Brian, all in favor? Aye. Excellent. And we need to set up the next meeting. So last time I skipped over that until the end. We'll get it done now. So let's see, this would be in January. We're gonna stick with this time, Monday?
So in January, if we were to go with this week, it would actually put us on the week of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which
okay.
offices are closed. If you want to go to the week after, it does become a little tight.
What about the Tuesday?
The Tuesday,
Should we try to do that?
the 21st, that there is already a meeting on Channel 18.
Okay, so we should stick with the Mondays.
So should stick with the Monday.
Dr. Cambereri is here.
Oh, good.
Oh, well.
Hello.
Tom.
Good evening, everybody. So what was that date again? Chris? Sorry. A week later, Monday.
So the 13th would be the week earlier. We could,
Monday.
yeah, there's an open space committee in here at 5, so we wouldn't be able to do that.
How about 2 weeks later? Could you make that?
We're traveling that week. So I'm back to 20 the week of the
27th.
What about the 28th?
That's a
From-
Monday.
That's
5
fine.
o'clock.
Yeah.
28th Tuesday is here?
Yeah, it's a Tuesday.
Oh, it's a Tuesday.
Technically, there's a Board of Health meeting until 5:30. We could start at 6 if you wanted to.
We're gonna get people confused. But that's okay with me. Everybody else?
Well, the-
Tuesday the 28th at 6.
Yeah.
But if we meet in this
Rob?
room, oh, you're talking about it won't be videotaped.
With the recording, yeah.
Actually, Rob, we should check in with you on this because you might be the main show. We're talking about our next meeting date, which will be January.
This is a show no one wants to show up for.
You check your calendar when you get settled.
When is this?
January 28th, it's a Tuesday. And I talked to Andrew too.
Yeah, Andrew's gonna do, I think Andrew's gonna, he's gonna zoom in.
You should be here.
He's gonna be in West Virginia, he told me. I think he's gonna be there, yeah. All right,
Can you be here though?
Yeah, I can be,
Okay.
believe,
The other
yeah.
thing is, while we're on the Zoom in, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have to get permission for that before.
The speaker can
Hybrid?
zoom.
Right, if it was a presenter,
Yeah.
we can have a
Okay.
Zoom
All right,
presenter.
so we don't need permission for that. All right, then let's plan on, unless anybody has a problem with that, January meeting next Tuesday, 6 PM. And Rob will have to get with Andrew. I did, as I said, I did talk to him.
Yeah, I talked to him as well.
And he's willing and able, but he did say he'd be remote.
Yeah,
This would be on the topic of growth issues associated.
yeah, I don't know if it'll take up a meeting, it's more like 15 minutes, but we'll see what, we can enlarge on that a bit.
Okay, all right, good. Well, that's the next meeting date, and that brings us to our primary item. Enhanced INA septic systems. Z, thanks for, done this a few times, this is not your first rodeo.
Thanks for volunteering me. Excuse my voice, a little raspy here.
Take it
Okay.
away.
I actually set this up and I did some background that we're all gonna know about, but I figure it's being televised, so let's just, go back a little bit. First of all, we're talking about estuary protection or water protection. We're gonna get into what are we talking about, but I think it's important to understand the difference. We, the town, are under a mandate to fix the regulatory portion, right? Estuary protection, we know that. Water protection, we're all gonna do because we're good citizens, but it's a conversation. But I'm not worried about these. I'm more worried about these. And these are what we're seeing more of in the estuaries on an ongoing basis. It's troubling. I can tell you one thing interesting anecdotally. For 5-6 years, we've raised oysters over here in Hyannis Harbor, but we've had to destroy them for the last 3 years. And I attribute that to water quality, frankly, unfortunately. So we're seeing declining water quality, even in what I think is probably one of our better bays. We know why. This is all about how many people there are. It's all about how many people there are over the last number of years. This is the estuaries. There's not many that are very good. Red is bad, blue is good. North side's got a couple of good ones. Hardly anybody else. So we know about this. This is the designated NSA area, nitrogen sensitive area that DEP has mandated. So we know we're in the green, but a lot of people are gonna be in the purple or whatever color that is. And over time, I think it's gonna have to be addressed on a wider scale. I wanted to point this out. This is just one well in Osterville, but when you think about nitrogen over time and you think about the impact of how many people there are, it's really interesting to go back in time. And even though this is one well, I think it's pretty representative of what we've seen across the town in terms of rising levels of nitrogen in the water through time. And this stops in the year 2000, so it's still going up. And Scott has pointed out to me a number of times, rising levels of nitrogen indicate rising levels of wastewater in our water. Troubling, but everybody needs to understand it. And this is another thing that I think, we're well aware of, but I always think illustrating it really points out how far the peninsula has to go. We're ahead in Barnstable. We've got more than anybody else in terms of sewer. And we're gonna do more than anybody else. But as a peninsula, we're sorely lacking, no doubt about that. This article ran not that long ago, and it really struck me. I was really floored. This is an article that was in the Wall Street Journal that said, your septic system can't be ignored. And then it went on to quote the fact that in Deuteronomy, they talk about really essentially a cesspool, a Title V system. Go away from the camp, dig a hole in the ground, cover it up. We're still doing that. It's crazy. It's amazing, but it's true. And I really think it's something that we need to think about because I really do believe we're at the golden age of distributed wastewater treatment technology, just like we are for our cell phones. Regulations are changing across the region. Tisbury is doing a lot. Here are some of the regulations that they've taken on. House sales, real estate transfers, upgrades, repairs, new construction, expansion, additions. You can read it. But these are all triggers for an upgrade to an EIA, or an innovative alternative septic system. And I would say this is something that this town and every town, everybody in this region really ought to be considering very seriously, no matter what else we do. Mashpee's moved on. The regulations that have been released are worth thinking about because we're still in process to understand exactly what the implications are for these new regulations in terms of expansion and growth. Rob is going to talk about that, sounds like, with Andrew. But even if the town's plan, this before DEP right now is accepted as a plan, what happens to new construction? We have a plan, but what happens to expansion? What happens to more growth and more people? We're housing constrained, we all know that. The systems that we're going to talk about, generally, the best ones are provisionally approved. I think most people know what that means. There's 3 levels of approval. Pilot, you need up to 12 systems for 2 years as a pilot. Then you need 50 systems, and it has to be a full 50 for another 3 years in provisional status before you're finally going to see general approval. The main system that we've worked on, we're going to talk about, that one's probably still a year away from general approval, and that's largely because the guys who have developed the system are still tweaking it a little bit. But that's what we hear. We think it's still a year away. And so, as an organization, and I want to point out publicly, this organization, my organization, where I'm executive director, Barnstable Clean Water Coalition, neither my organization nor I, nor anybody has any kind of a vested interest in the main technology we're going to talk about. It just so happens it was the best technology we were able to find. We're going to talk about that. That was from working with the team at MassTech, the Massachusetts Alternative Septic System Test Center, that tests many, many systems. And we looked over time for the best one. And the best one had a lot of different characteristics, so we'll talk about what those are. This is Shubal Pond. It's in the Three Bays watershed. It's identified there. You can see it on the left-hand side. It has had harmful algal blooms over time. The town has done an alum treatment. Was that last year? I think it was last year.
Yeah,
So,
2023.
I think it's become less problematic, but this area was targeted because the US EPA and the US Geological Survey identified it as an area where we could do a study. And the whole idea here was alternative septic systems are being put in a lot of different locations, but nobody's testing them comprehensively. So just because somebody on the waterfront somewhere puts one in, you really don't know how it works. How does it work if we put a bunch of them in, and how do we figure that out? And so that's what we're going to talk about. And I did a handout. That handout has 2 papers in it, publicly available for anybody that wants to write to me that needs a copy. I'm going to provide a copy to anybody who wants it. On the left is a map that the US Geological Survey has done, which identifies every septic system or cesspool in the entire Three Bays watershed. On the right is the Shubal Pond, and the area where we did the demonstration project is located. We purposely picked an area with 1/4 acre zoning. It's not environmental justice, but it is definitely working class neighborhood. Small lots, we wanted to make sure we could show that these alternative systems could be put in to a small lot and still be successful. This is a picture of the system that we're using for the most part. We tried one other system, we'll talk about that. So this system, which is everything in one box, unless you've got a bigger house, then it would be in 2 different traditional size, either 1,500 or 2,000 gallon concrete tanks that are generally available.
So is that like a 3-bedroom kind of basically?
This is up to 4.
Up to 4.
Up to 4.
Okay.
3 to 4 bedrooms, no problem. So what's good about it, and how does it work? So I call it the best-in-class performance. It's low cost, relatively low cost. We're going to talk about cost a little bit. It's modular, so you can expand it if you want to. Low maintenance. So the way it works is in the chamber on the top side, you can see those rocks. Those rocks are limestone. Limestone controls the pH. Underneath those limestones is plastic media, kind of frisbee-like objects that allow a lot of surface area, and recirculation is what's going on. The only working part in this tank is an air pump recirculating air. It's not oxygen, it's air. And that's causing nitrification. In order to denitrify, you've got to nitrify first. In the second section, you can see wood chips. Wood chips provide a carbon source where in an anoxic environment, an environment that's no oxygen, you basically fool the bacteria into respirating nitrogen, and they turn into gas. Any kind of wood chip works. Doesn't have to be one particular kind of wood chip. How long does it last? Evidence seems to say that for this particular system, the limestone may be between 40 and 70 years. The wood chips, I'd say 2 decades, but we gotta wait and see. It's gonna take time. You know, one of the benchmarks that we've thought about is at Wacoya, a test was done by Ken Foreman at the Marine Biological Labs where he put in a permeable reactive barrier, a trench that had wood chips in it about 15 years ago now. He still goes and tests it. You can dig it up. It's about 2 feet under the sand, right on the beach. It's actually still working. You can still see how it's changed the conditions of the bay. But the wood chips are pretty fresh. You can't break them in half. They're not rotten. They don't just go bad. Carbon probably does get used up over time, but the way this is structured is you can suck the wood chips out, just like you would a septic tank, and remove the waste. Then you can put new wood chips back in. You can also open it up and put limestone back in. Go ahead, Brian.
Can you lift the cover and then put in some other technology if some such gets designed to handle the other?
I think you could put things on the tail end that would do that, and that's the way the design would work. You could put something, we'll talk about that a little bit for CECs, contaminants of emerging concern. Could you do something to treat phosphorus? The answer is yes, but that still needs to be proven. So low maintenance, real-time monitoring is really key. So if it's not working, you know, the guy who runs the business has a pager, it goes off, and he'll make a call. And he'll say, Z, it's not working, what's wrong? Go ahead, Rob.
What's the difference between that and a classic Title V system? I mean, if you had a picture of a
So this is
classic Title V
between,
next to it,
yeah,
what would
this
be the
is-
difference?
There's still a septic tank in front of this tank before it, in terms of where the flow is. So the septic tank is still holding the solids.
Yeah?
The liquids float to the surface and then move into this system, the treatment tank.
All right.
After this system, you then have currently a traditional leaching field, although we're gonna hopefully ultimately get permission to shrink that leaching field. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I didn't know that, so that's
Yeah.
interesting. So there's a traditional tank in front of that.
Yeah.
This goes right between the septic and the leach field.
Leach field. So this is gonna, it's gonna take up more space in a typical lot, and that
But
can,
one of the values of this, in comparison to other IA systems, is that for some reason, if the treatment system middle part goes out,
Yeah.
you still have a Title V wrapped around it.
I got it.
So even in the bottom bullet, even in the worst case scenario, you've got a Title V system.
And if this goes out, it doesn't interfere with the Title V system?
No, the gravity is still gravity.
It's all gravity flow.
Only the oxygen is off, so you're not denitrifying.
Okay.
But you could lose power for weeks and you'd still be
Okay, that's
operating.
interesting.
And as he said, one of the reasons he picked that neighborhood is small lots. So
Yeah.
most lots in the town are bigger than that, so.
And Title V mandates, as I understand it, our friends down here may know, it mandates excess space. So no matter, even in these small lots,
Yeah.
there was already existing space to put this tank in by design.
Okay.
So there's room.
Can I just add, the other thing, and Z mentioned it briefly, is John Smith's doing some testing on solids coming out the back end, much lower than a Title V. And what that means is a chance that TEP is gonna allow a reduction in the leach field area. So back to your footprint, possible this may be actually less than a Title V, because the leach field is the largest footprint
Yeah.
in a Title V system. There's a chance that could be cut significantly down. He's
When do
actually
you
putting.
opine on that? Is that with general approval that they'll opine on that? Or are they gonna wait till after general approval and then bring in for a
Good
while and
question.
do
It's a
that?
good question. Testing's, we're gonna get to that at the very end. I show some data on it. Go ahead.
This is just interesting. So in an existing Title V, can you put one of these in the middle of it? I mean,
That's
or do you have to
what-
start
that's what-
all over again?
No, that's what they did in
No.
this neighborhood.
That's the
Oh, so
beauty
you,
of it.
so you
Even,
can pop it down inside an
Right.
existing system.
Well, physically, it doesn't always go right between. You might have to go out and back,
Right.
which is what they
you
did.
just need gravity and a pipe to tell you where it,
Okay,
needs
got
to
it.
flow
Alright,
to,
okay.
to make it work.
All right.
But yeah, that's the beauty of the system. It's all in one tank. You can drop it in, and there you go. And about 60% of the ones we replaced at Schubel, we were able to reuse some element. So there's no reason you can't use the septic tank that's already there. Saves you money. Sometimes you can reuse the leaching field if it's relatively new. It's already there, you can use it. So you're just putting in this system. And because of that, there's a variable pricing, and we're gonna talk about the pricing a little bit later. Anything else, John, you wanna bring up?
What's the size of that tank approximately?
That one is either a 1,500 gallon or 2,000
Yeah.
gallon tank. It's not as big as this table. It's probably half as big as this table.
About the size of a
little
normal
wider.
septic tank.
A little wider.
Yeah. 5
and,
by
6 feet tall,
five
something like that.
by
5, yeah.
8. Yeah.
Same as a regular septic tank, essentially,
Yeah.
yeah.
So with the plan, the sewer plan, we're still gonna have a lot of white space, we're still gonna have a lot of areas that aren't treated, even if we do the entire plan. And so, part of what we've been spending time as a nonprofit doing is saying, hey, how do we treat these other areas? What are we gonna do? How do we go after them? There's a lot of reasons to do that, not least of which, my guess is people, especially on the north side, who are on private wells, are gonna wanna have a treatment system of some kind. So that's a big part of the story here, but this is just a simple math, which may be slightly different, and you guys can correct me on any of my math that's wrong, because it's not meant to be perfect, it's meant to be directionally correct in terms of what the CWMP is. And I know it's changed, you guys are modifying it, regularly, so this may be somewhat dated based on what's there. The gray area, it's important to note, is currently sewer. So that's what showed up on the earlier map. With the future illustrated here, 3 phases, 30 years. I think everybody's well aware of that plan. So one of the things we talked about and we've thought about is, even as we put in sewer along the spine in these critically important areas, and by the way, as a nonprofit, we're all about, we gotta sewer as much as we can, as much as we can afford, as quickly as we possibly can. But in the meantime, we're gonna talk about time to travel in a minute. Groundwater travels about 1 to 4 feet a day on Cape Cod. How do we go after areas where we're close to the water already, and we know that the wastewater is going into whatever the troubled water body is pretty quickly? So this is Oyster Harbor's, Katuitt, just as an illustration. And so we're saying these areas actually have enormous loads, especially when you look at the graphic on the lower right, which is water usage by time of year. It's not a surprise to anybody here. It's 70% of the usage is between May and September. And there's a lot of people on the Cape, a lot of people in those houses, a lot of flushing going on. And so we're loading these bays, even though it's not in a lot of the Massachusetts Estuary Project load modeling as targeted to be removed. I can't help but feel that it's gonna be very helpful over time to think about looking at different ways to put in alternative septic systems. And I'll also say, chances are pretty good. Most of the people who live next to the water can afford one of these. I'll probably get a shout out for that.
Could you go back to that for a second?
Yeah.
So one of the things that we've been, 'cause I don't disagree with this concept, I like the concept, but one of the things that we've been trying to think about a lot is, and Amber's been running this for us, is, so scientifically, 400 feet versus 1,000 feet versus 500 feet versus 750 feet, trying to find a way to get a hook scientifically to that.
Yeah.
So if you guys, I don't know if was your 400 feet arbitrary, or was there something that dictated the 400?
No, we just tried to think about what would be the first step.
Yeah.
I think of it as being probably a series of steps. And part of that might depend on how successful we're being with sewer rollout.
Okay,
And costs.
I was just looking
It's really
at,
about that.
again, I'm not beating back on it, just saying,
Yeah,
okay,
no.
because if, showing my hand on this, to me, I think what the committee really needs to wrestle with is, okay, where do we employ these and how do we employ these? You know, and so we started looking at, is there anything magical to 500, you know, with phosphorus, 300 feet. There's a reason for that, it's scientifically justifiable, that sort of thing. We've been trying to think about it from a nitrogen perspective, and I know you guys have different perspectives on that, so I'd be interested in the conversation about what's the right, or is there a right distance back from a water body to be protective that you can sort of scientifically justify, and that.
Rob, I'm just gonna mention your question about where do you cite these, where do you go first? And I think that in terms of the distance, closer is better, I think is the answer, because.
So that's intuitive, but I can't prove that.
But the other thing that I think is maybe more important, and I'm basing this on experience in Tisbury and now Wellfleet, that to tie the upgrades triggered to a homeowner initiative.
Mm-hmm.
So the homeowner is building a new house, that's an easy one. I gotta put an addition on, they gotta dig up their yard, get one in then. And repairs, obviously, and then the other one might be real estate transactions. So that isn't a distance thing, but it makes it a lot more convenient.
I mean, I lived here in '94, I had a house in Centerville underneath Watertown. My cesspool died, and I went to the town and said, hey, my cesspool died, and they said, okay, well, you can't put another one in. You have to put a Title V in. I mean, that natural transition, I think, makes some sense. But do you do it for the entire nitrogen-sensitive watershed? Do you do it for only within a certain number of feet of the water body? And so we started chewing on, is there a magic number, this dilution? What is it? Because intuitively, I agree with you that closer feels better.
Yeah.
Because it happens faster.
Sure.
But does it make a difference if it's closer versus farther away in the end of the day? And that's what we're trying to get our hands on.
You and I talked a little bit about this, and I'm still intrigued with this concept of present value of water quality benefits. Present value is a really important technique in economics and finance, right? Return on investment if you're an investor. So why aren't we thinking about return on investment for water quality? In that case, again, I don't think there's a magic number, but closer is better. And if you say that water quality improvement in the next 3 years is better than 30 to 50 years from now, in my opinion, most people would agree with that, then let's go after the stuff that's closer.
Yeah.
It's worth more money, I think.
That's an interesting way to put it.
And here we go ahead, Dan.
Just picking up on that, return on investment.
Yeah.
So going back to the last slide, and this may be relevant, is, okay, I would agree that any nitrogen removed is good, right? Question is, what percent of the nitrogen in that watershed is that? In other words, is it 2% or is it 30%? And that's where the return on investment makes a difference.
Yeah.
2% may not make an appreciable difference in the water body.
Right.
Or it may, or if it's 30%, it may make a significant difference.
Yeah.
So that's, we try to have to get a handle on that.
Yeah.
As part of, another piece of information.
I don't think this graphic was intended to be that's the solution. This is
No.
starting.
I understand.
Yeah, we get
And
Yeah.
That's why I started by saying
Yeah.
any nitrogen removal
Right.
is a good thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we moved to this table, so that we could have these kind of conversations and start chewing on
Yeah,
issues.
and it's hard to, we know that we were all hoping, and we really haven't had all the math, that the dredging of the Katuah Cut, which just happened again, probably changes that math, right? So you might say, 2 years ago, some of these houses were more important than they are now, because we just opened up the bay a little bit again, we're getting a lot more
I
flushing.
think the last
Maybe.
time we looked at that, the impact of dredging was somewhere around 2%
Right,
or.
it's not big.
Pretty small.
It was insignificant. You couldn't actually see a significant change in the water quality data as a result of the inlet opening.
But again, it's helpful.
Right.
Yeah,
no
it
doubt.
wasn't
Right, so-
negative, for.
It's one of those things that intuitively, again, sort of makes sense.
The little numbers add up, so I still think that there's no reason that we should decide what the area is, which is part of why I wanted to look at this, which is a time to travel map. It's a blunt instrument, because it's not a perfect map showing exactly where things happen. I'm always fascinated though, because if you look at Oyster Harbors, again, just to pick on it, and you say, really, the middle of Oyster Harbors is 50 to 100 years? What's up with that? Seriously? Could that really be?
So red's
That's what it
less
shows,
than, so
okay,
red's
that's-
less than 10 on that?
Yeah.
How
Yeah,
is
so
it red, like
the-
way up by?
The orange or pink or whatever it is,
Because of the river.
it's a rapid area, less than 10 for a very large area, very big area. Which I think is, so to me, that's the low-hanging fruit, is that less than 10-year area, that's where we wanna be targeting. And so, maybe if some people are in other areas, they get relief. It's not as important, it's not as critical.
I'm gonna steal a little bit of his thunder. He's got the map around the bay close by. The other thing we gotta remember is we got Little River and Marston's Mills River coming in here, and that's a direct shot. It's 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours away, so that shoreline map actually goes all the way up the rivers too.
The thing that's remarkable to me about this is if you look at like Lawrence Pond and Sandwich and Triangle Pond, to one side of Triangle Pond, it's 100-year travel time, and to the other side of Triangle Pond, it's 10 years travel time.
Go figure.
Wow.
What's this?
Any idea what the
That don't look
mechanism
right.
is?
What's the source of this?
USGS.
USGS, yeah.
And but USGS isn't perfect, we know that, right? Because Schuylkill Pond, where we thought that the water was flowing in one direction, it turned out to flow in another direction. So these are models, they're not perfect. So a lot of testing, to some extent needs to be done to understand what some of these time to travel things mean from a modeling standpoint.
So are you proposing that the regulation should be based upon proximity to water or travel time to water? Saying, well, if you live 3 miles away, you don't have to replace your system even if it fails.
Potentially, I would say that potentially that makes some sense. It doesn't make sense if you're running the pipe and you're running the big pipe and you're going in neighborhoods. I'm not sure that one guy gets a pass and another guy doesn't get a pass just because, we drew a line. But I do think that to some degree, it tells you, let's work smart as well as working hard. Let's target the areas that we know are gonna be the first line of contribution, not the ones that are 50 years on.
So Brian, just to pick up on that if I may, really that's what this committee is gonna chew on. What Z's presenting today, and my guess is we'll have 2 to 3 meetings at least of conversations about this at the minimum, is sort of the technology and what it can do. And then what the committee can chew on is because at the end of the day, this is a policy conversation. Do we wanna do anything? Where do we wanna do it? Where we feel it's appropriate? We then would have to have a conversation with Board of Health and see what they're comfortable doing. So there'll be other jurisdictions we'll have to bring in, but I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Z, none of this is Z saying this is what you need to do. It's more, this is what the technology can do, here's some ways to think about it. But then this is a committee.
That's why I wanted to raise that question.
Yeah. And I just, as a nonprofit, we're just trying to present ideas, present options. Let's look at things. We do that from a financial standpoint too, further on. It's a lot of different things we could talk about, a lot of things we could do. Town's gonna vote on it, people are gonna have decisions to make, committees are gonna vote on it, we'll have decisions to put before, the populace at large and town council at large, so we'll see.
It's smart
So-
to look at it that way. The regulation looks at that watershed and figures out, okay, in a steady state situation, all that nitrogen is getting in there at a certain percentage, and it doesn't work that way, as we see with this map of time of travel. And then, so there's a lot of certainty and regulation about using the science to set it up. That certainty drives pretty big costs to comply with it. And the goal of us as citizens is clean water, regardless of what's driving. And so when I look at your study here and the effluent coming out of the septic system is 100. And it's that actually in leaving, it's a lot higher than the assumptions that were used in the MEP that drive this. And so, maybe the stuff the work that Brian House did, it does integrate some assimilation to get that model to work. And so we used the 35. But if you have 100 coming out of that stuff, the chances are, the closer you are to the water, that concentration, is going to kind of maintain itself at that level. So you do have a better chance of taking higher amount of nitrogen out by attacking the nitrogen in a fastest travel time to the embayment. So it seems, I think we're onto something, and definitely worth talking about some more here, because we want to get it out fast.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a history major, so. And I have bad vision because I'm an old history major. So what are you saying? The sort of reddish orange is the stuff that's moving very fast, and the purple is moving very
It's not
slowly.
moving faster, it's just closer, so it takes less time to get there. If all the groundwater is moving, let's say 1 foot per day, but this stuff up here is so far away, it's gonna take close.
Yeah, but it's,
Yeah, but I think
I'm
Rob's
push
right.
back, I'm
Rob's
push back,
right. I think
push back
you're right,
on
the
that.
way you're,
All right.
the way you described it.
Because this purple, which is a long way away,
Yeah.
fairly close to the water,
Yeah.
so,
There's some purple
So-
right
so,
next to it.
so that's the first point I wanna
Yeah,
make.
no, it's a good point.
So I'm just trying to say.
Scott tells you he's colorblind.
I forgive him because I knew that, and he also just had a birthday. I don't know if everybody else knows.
Oh, should we sing for
So
Scott?
he's moved into a whole new level. You know what I mean?
Decade.
But you just turned 55, Scott? Just turned 55?
The other question I want to ask is, is this business, so there's about speed, and that makes sense to me, that really, and I agree with what both you and Tom are saying about that. But then there's the whole issue of volume, how much is, some of these areas that you're talking about are not heavily developed, and some are. So when we look at this, it's got to be the combination of those two
Yeah,
things, right? I mean, it's not only how fast it's moving or how quickly, but also how much of it is coming through that particular area. Is that a
So
fair
that's,
consideration?
so you can see the density right there.
Yeah,
So it's
density
a fair-
matters.
It's a fair point because
Yeah.
we've got well fields within some of these areas.
Right.
I mean, so one of the things to consider, and Amber and I were talking about this the other day, is, and Scott and I have talked about this, is should the town actually get credit for some of the water that's taken by the water wells out of the system? We know that, for instance, the Marston's Mills River, which contributes roughly 30% of the excess load, 8,000 to 9,000 kilograms a year flows down that river.
Yeah.
Okay, we're trying to get rid of around 22 roughly, okay?
Yeah.
Now, that should be a gaining stream. But COMM takes 5 million gallons a day out of the well field. So it should be a gaining stream, it actually goes down.
Okay,
Okay, so we're actually pulling nitrogen-loaded water out.
right.
We're putting it back into the system, we're recharging with it, we're irrigating our lawns with it. I mean, so there's an argument to be made. So trying to get to that math, though, is incredibly difficult. Tom is smarter than I am on that kind of thing, but it's a challenge. But you're right, there's a lot of areas that are not dense, so.
One of the
I think that's an important
advantages of
factor.
this, of the IAs versus sewers in some areas is the density.
Right.
In sewers, it's a major factor. It's, sometimes roughly half the cost. If you go to a less dense area, it goes up dramatically, whereas IAs, there's no difference, whether
Could
it's.
you go back to the CWMP picture?
The previous one?
Go back to
Which one?
The map, the CWP map.
Map, that one?
No, next one. No, I thought I saw it. There it is. Just, I know it's in the homework, but I want to hit it again to get to Scott's point. So the CWMP was devised in phases.
Right.
Phase 1, 2, and 3. And if you notice, phase 3 is the yellow phase off in Marston's Mills. And what it states very clearly is that the hope is that alternative work that we're doing on the Marston's Mills River, and frankly, Barnstable Clean Water Coalition's got a big dog in that fight too, and has been great on that. And alternative work with maybe IAs or maybe other things can eventually make that yellow section less important. Now, since it was written, we've now started to learn more and more about the freshwater needs.
Yeah.
And so some of that may get driven by freshwater needs, i.e. Marston's Mills Pond, Long Pond, Schubel's Pond, et cetera. But the thought process was always, one of the values of having that year 20 to 30 was it gives us time to look at alternatives, deal with some alternatives, and then maybe because we're in the same watershed, particularly since Marston's Mills River runs right through the middle of all that, eliminate some of that, because that is where it's less dense than other places. That's the farthest away to get to, and topographically, it's the most challenging too. And that it's hillier, I guess, for lack of a better term. So it requires more pump stations, it requires more technology than coming back this way. So Rob, to your point
Yeah.
about density, it's in the plan because we needed to account for how we get to the total thing with just this plan.
Right,
But the thought process has always been, and that's why we have these 5-year bites at this thing,
right.
that if we come up with other ways, that's the first thing we would like to start to talk about. And again, not trying to disadvantage the freshwater stuff. I get I've got a freshwater responsibility out there. But that's why that's there, to do with just what Scott was talking about.
That's one of the reasons that I look at this map and I say, that's great, and not, you know, I'll pick on where I live on Oyster Harbors, but that never gets anything. So, you know, to me, when I've done the math, and I've done the math, so about 25% again of the excess load that we're talking about, if you just looked at water usage alone, which is a blunt instrument, but if you look at that, Little Island and Oyster Harbors generate about that much load. So whether it's 2% to Dan's point or not, it's a really significant number. Significant enough that I would say, hey, in that area, we ought to be mandating EIAs based on upgrades, changes, building, all that kind of stuff. Should mean over time, you know, we're looking at these things going in. I'm not saying you knock on the door and say you have to go in next week, but you know, these changes really should drive adoption like that. So we're looking at that area, and probably the same with the yellow area. And I'm going to get to that and why that's the way I think about that area too.
And to speak to what Z just said, the reason why that didn't happen during the first go-around is, one, we didn't have an IA tool for nitrogen that was ready to play with. And two, is we can't put a sewer pipe across a drawbridge. You know, it doesn't work so well. So at that point, we left it knowing that may be something we can, eventually technology will come along that we can go back and get to what was just said.
Okay, well, we're gonna let's keep going on. So a little bit more on Schubel and the importance of what we're learning here. So you're gonna see some data in a minute about performance. But we looked at this area at Schubel, and there was around 11 milligrams in the groundwater. This is a very high number in the groundwater itself, okay? I showed you that background data from the water map from the 1950s, which was like 0.2. So 11 is a big freaking number. And so what we really were hoping, and we're still hoping to get, and we actually thought the water was going into the pond, not out of the pond. That's what we learned. Models are not always correct. It's okay because we're still monitoring this area. USGS monitors this quarterly. We measure household usage and we ring fence so that we're only looking at household usage. We've separated any outside water use. We look at that monthly in terms of influent, what's going into the tank, effluent, what's coming out of the tank. We measure, in several cases, lysimeters underneath the leaching field itself. And then quarterly, you've got 34 plus wells that are being monitored to look at groundwater and how's that moving. You know, one of the things that I'm hoping to learn over time, we really haven't seen a good number yet, is according to scientists like Tom, when you look at the 11 and you say, okay, well, we know these are septic systems and cesspools. We know that there's rain, we know that there's this, we know that there's that. But what could we see a change occur in the groundwater over time? And good scientists say the math may be such that if we have a system, as we see in this case, that's reducing around 95% of the nitrogen, theoretically you could see 11 go to 1. You could see 11 go to less than 1. And if we see that kind of change, it's really going to be meaningful because nobody's done that work anywhere. And so I think that's going to be really helpful to understand the implications for recharge, the implications for what happens when we've got wide adoption in whatever area of these systems. So I said this already, this is how often we're doing the monitoring and checking, and we're not doing it. Mass Tech does all the work, so for the monitoring of the individual systems, USGS and EPA, it's really USGS, they do all the groundwater, and they have several what are called multi-level sample wells that are 80 feet deep, and they measure every 4 feet. So we're looking at a pretty good cut of water across the bases. Got a lot of partners, including the town here. It's important to recognize everybody. A lot of people have helped. So back to Tom, you know, your comments. This is a little bit dated, but it's still relevant. So this gives you an influent, the blue numbers influent into the 13 homes. So the numbers are extraordinarily high, much higher than Mass DEP numbers would say are real numbers. The good news is, in this case, the effluent numbers are pretty low. So we're getting 3. It's not a perfect number, and there's some variability. And certainly in cold weather, the bugs don't do as much as they do in warm weather. But the numbers are pretty powerful. And they're still pretty consistent.
Excuse me, see that, go back to the, look at the dates. This integrates winter and summer data.
Yeah.
This is average.
Yeah.
Better than this in the summer, a little worse in the winter.
Yeah.
By the time it gets
So
to the
this data
bay.
is talked about in the papers that I gave everybody. By the way, the short one is easier to read. The other one is heavy-duty scientific stuff that even I have a hard time, even though my name's on it. So this, I think, is really interesting because this is using the water usage data and the math around the reduction to look at how many kilograms of nitrogen are actually being pulled out of each household, annualizing those numbers. It's a lot. It's a lot. To Tom's point, it's probably more than we really would think. So I think that's important and a benchmark that we'll be able to use through time. These are the papers that I just handed out, so you guys have seen them. We've tried to do a lot of good communication across the board to talk to the community about what we're doing. This is gonna be moving over to some of the stuff that Mass Tech produces. So one of the real, conundrums, I think, is we had a meeting earlier, Scott and I were in a meeting, and, for the general public, it's like, how do I make a decision about this? I'm gonna say, oh, I need to get an IA. Where do I go? Well, whose door do I knock on? Who do I call? We really don't have the answers to that yet. Mass Tech is doing some work. This is a Falmouth data slice. I find this would be a difficult graph. George Hoyfelder developed it, so I'm not gonna pick too much on him. But what it's saying is the system that we've been testing all the way on the left is much more consistent than all the other systems that you're seeing. And that's part of the reason that we've chosen this particular system, is because it gives you pretty consistent performance through time, and really almost nothing else does. They've got some other areas on the website you can go to and look at the performance of individual systems. You can tease it out. You can look at, for instance, how many systems of this particular kind of technology perform below a certain level. So you can see this case, and this is not just Schubel, this is across the board what was out there a year or so ago. 80% below 10 milligrams, pretty good numbers. We talked about the math of how do you pay for this stuff and what are we gonna do? How do we finance it? So there is a state tax credit. You have to be a resident. It's a 4-year program. It's $18,000. I'm writing a new newsletter that'll be out soon. It's not ready yet, where I try to break down and look at the math around this. I'm gonna show a slide, but there's gonna be more details coming up. But the point is, when you look at this, not everybody earns enough money to take advantage of this tax credit, first of all. Not everybody is a resident, second of all, so they can't take advantage of it. So how do we come up with other mechanisms to help people pay for a number that still is non-trivial, right? $45,000, still a big chunk of money. Simple math around the sewer numbers, and this is just using some of the latest data, and you guys can call me out on it. If I just do simple math and say, okay, what's the spend? What do we get? It's about $140,000 per home to sewer at this point. And I know I'm using long-tailed numbers that aren't completely fair, but just so we can look at numbers, we're saying that about $20,000 is the cap to an individual homeowner. You're gonna pay $10,000 when the sewer gets to the curb, and then you're responsible for the hookup, which is a very variable number. Could be a couple $1,000 if you're right there at the sewer. If you're down a hill somewhere and you're gonna grinder pump, it's gonna cost you a lot more. We use an average of another $10,000 to say, for individuals, it's $20,000 in total. For an IA, we're doing similar math, and then I break it down further on a slide I think I have coming up to look at what are the other levers that we could pull as a town. So this is another way to illustrate that. And it's not completely fair because I don't know and we don't know what access we're gonna have to SRF funding, other mechanisms, grants that we get from the state. Some loans are forgiven, some are not. There's a lot of different things that go into the mix of trying to finance the work that the team is doing on the municipal expansion, or whether it's the ability to finance individual septic systems. But Scott, you may wanna just chime in on what you're able to do. I don't have illustrations, but for Wellfleet, where you are gonna get the ability to use some SRF funds for IAs, which I think is a critical part of the possibility, if we can get permission to do that, get DEP and the state to allow SRF funding to be used comprehensively for IA systems, it's gonna make a big difference across the board.
Yeah, so Wellfleet was successful twice in getting, 2 years in a row, getting SRF funding for the IA upgrades. And I think that's the first and only time in the state that that's been used for, on-site systems. In fact, when we first approached DEP 3 years ago, they essentially said, no, we've never done that. And so in the second meeting, we asked a second question. The second question was, why not? And then the third meeting, they said, maybe this will work. So we've been working with them for a year or two, and so we did succeed in getting SRF funding, which is great. And we are looking at this discussion of cost sharing, which is a tricky issue. How much the homeowner pays, how much you put on an SRF loan. I think this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is intended for the forgiveness of the loan through the Cape and Islands Trust Fund, and this is still SRF, I think, in this model. So this
everything's funded at this
is probably
point.
the loan part, which becomes a tax-based payment, because you gotta pay it back. And this is the forgiveness, which essentially becomes a grant, right? 25%, so I think that's what's going on there, and that's what we're looking at. I mean, the Wellfleet Select Board is looking at a bunch of different ways to cost share this. Yeah.
Is there anywhere else in the state besides this region that's looking at enhanced, systems like this? In other words, is this a statewide problem? Because I'm sure they're looking at it going, we've only got so much, and if everybody starts to line up, then you have a problem, So I'm curious, is the Berkshires, or is the Merrimack Valley?
Actually, the best example is Long Island, Suffolk County.
No, but I'm talking about Massachusetts.
No, I would say most of the activity on this, to my knowledge, is down here. On the vineyard for sure.
Obviously, but in other words, this isn't a statewide issue, it's not gonna play out that way for them.
Well, I mean, nitrogen is primarily an issue in marine waters, and the North Shore is so well flushed that it's hard to find a place up there that has a problem. So it's really southeastern Mass and the Cape and Islands.
That's important.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the SRF is a loan, so it's still gotta pay for it.
Right.
So how does this work with installations on private property? Who's paying the loan?
Well, and that's a big question, right? And that's, you guys have brought that up earlier as well. How do you expect the town to pay for something on private property? I think this is a world that we have to get into if we're gonna start using these at scale. We're really gonna face, it's gonna mean we're gonna cut some regulatory ground in order to be able to maintain, monitor, get funding for these systems. But I think that, one of the disconnects, and we had some EPA folks in the meeting we were in earlier who said, oh yeah, we tried to finance some of these things, but the view is it's an individual household, so it's only benefiting the individual household. Well, we all know, that's not true, because it goes in the groundwater and then it's a community issue. It's not an individual issue. So, I mean, there's work to do, but Scott just brought up, Long Island just passed a $6 billion, bill to pay for IA systems across that region. So it's not like people aren't understanding that we gotta figure out how to do this.
But that's not a state, that's a county, right?
Yeah,
I think some of the money did come through the state before the county, I'm not sure.
So did, in the case of Wellfleet, and you said Tisbury, the state agreed to use the state SRF funding?
Yeah, well,
Did
Tisbury.
they make a regulation or policy, or is it just a one-off kind of situation?
Good question. First of all, it's not Tisbury, because Tisbury homeowners are paying all the freight on everything except for affordable.
Okay,
So, and they don't have an SRF grant yet.
all right.
So Wellfleet has the 2 grants, and we, this question about using SRF money on private property was an interesting one.
Yeah.
And we did, I don't have a piece of paper to prove it yet, but they did make the grant, and what we've agreed to is that the SRF money can go to pay for equipment, the treatment unit, which is about 20 to 25 grand of the 45.
Okay.
The other part of it, the installation work, cannot be paid through for SRF, and that would be paid for either partly or fully by the homeowner and or other town financing. And so, and the example we got was actually from Falmouth grinder pumps. At first they said you can't use state money, SRF money, to put anything on private property. It's like, what about the grinder pumps?
But those are paid, like at least here, those are paid by Betterment.
Okay.
So technically, they're not paid, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, they're not paid by the SRF grant. Each homeowner pays a betterment, and it comes out of that the cost of the grinder pump was built into that
In
betterment.
order to use SRF funding for grinder pumps, the town has to own and have an easement over them and
Right.
maintain them.
So that's a different,
But we're buying.
Well, that was the
them with
suggestion
We
from
don't buy them with
Falmouth.
SRF funds.
I'm not sure how they did it, but
you buy them out of Andy's budget,
Yeah.
But where'd that money come from in Andy's budget?
the general fund.
No, did not. Not for Stewart's Creek.
the example was Falmouth. And GHD was the company that was suggesting that's how it was done. GHD is working in Wellfleet also.
Yeah, no, I just, we've had, as Griffin said, we've had some conversations about grinder pumps as an example.
Yeah.
I think the takeaway here is that there's not a clean path yet. You know, to Z's point, there's work that has to be done.
Yeah.
On sort of the funding thing. One of the things that I'm concerned about regarding this, these slides always tend to set up an either or situation.
Yeah, it's not
You know,
that-
and I hate that.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that I'm worried about is that, and I was talking to Jane Ward about it today, and Bruce and I've talked about this, so SRF is capped to each individual community at a certain dollar level per year. So for instance, we have the plant under an SRF, the whole plant is under SRF, but we can only get $50 million a year towards it. So if you start doing like a IA thing out of that same cap, that feels adversarial.
Right.
To me, what would be ideal
Yeah.
is if DEP said, look, there's SRF traditional, which is what we have. That's this pot of money. There's this other pot of money or SRF alternative that you can't use for that, and this money can't be used for that. So now communities have a pot of money that they can't use for anything but this.
Right.
So the incentive then at that point in time is to say, okay, my 15 million a year or 10 million a year or 2 million a year, whatever that number is that they would set up as an SRF alternative money, that then becomes an incentive to drive this conversation versus it being a competitive fighting over resources thing.
But you're gonna be fighting over those resources anyway, because if you start tapping into that fund for this technology, you're up against Salem and,
Sure.
you know, Worcester, and you're eating into what is as you point out, a limited amount of money.
But we've been,
So you're in a dogfight. It's just a different one. It's not between the two technologies. It's between different parts of the state and different communities who are looking at the Cape and saying, hey, you're grabbing a bigger chunk than you really are entitled to because you're opening up this door and going in there for this particular function, you know? I think, I mean, I could be wrong.
So that's true.
Yeah.
So, two things. SRF is a loan, and the benefit of it is an attractive interest rate, but not always. When the market, when the loan market and bond market is attractive, it can be actually higher with an SRF loan. So that's depends. But the other issue is the Cape Cod Collaborative, the Water Protection Fund, pays a subsidy to SRF eligible projects. Does that apply to Like,
I think it would.
We think it would. We don't, it hasn't happened yet. Hasn't
We asked them that.
Yeah, we should. When we get Andy in here.
Because then it's real money that's
Absolutely.
it's cash.
That's the plan.
So to your competition thing, we're kind of in that dogfight now, but what
Oh,
we
yeah.
found recently, you know, so like the plant was #1 in the state last year,
Say
right?
this last IUP, we had the #1 and the #3 project in the state.
So we've been competing now, and we're competing well.
Yeah.
And it feels like, and I don't know this for a fact, I'm just conjecture, but it feels like DEP has recognized that there's
Big issue.
there's an issue here, and they're putting financial resources towards it.
That makes
That's why I like the idea, if there was a separate thing to say, look, you know, deal with this there, that to me feels ideal. But again, all of this is stuff that needs to get thought through, chewed out, at well above our pay grade, but we can certainly try to help with that process.
The other thing that I'm still unclear on, and I actually called Andy the other day, because he's pretty smart on this stuff, the financing, is when you use this 18K tax credit. Oops.
You broke it.
If you read the legislation, which I've only read 3 times so far, so I'm just getting acquainted. There's language in there about it's not allowable if there's other state assistance, or it reduces the amount you can get, so I'm kind of under the impression you can't get both, but I don't know the details, and frankly, Andy didn't either, so I felt better when he didn't know. So this is something we gotta get clarification on, is how you can mix the 18K tax credit and other loan issues. I don't know the answer to that yet.
So here's a slide taken just to further complicate and get everybody thinking. This is from my new newsletter, which hasn't been published yet, but it's about to be. So this is taking only phase 3 and thinking about it and saying, what if we did IAs, how might we carve that up, okay? And so we did a lot of demographic work. So if you look on the left, I actually did work, and I have another slide that I'll show in a minute, where I looked and said, we scraped the data and said, how many bedrooms are in a household? How big is that lot? And so could you theoretically get an additional bedroom, and could that be an ADU? Okay? It's a big number, it's over 500. We said, let's take half of that number and say that those people actually would get an ADU. Rough math on ADU that I did indicated that an ADU would add about $250,000 to value for a home on Cape Cod, okay? A 0.9 mill rate would mean that your taxes would go up by about $2,200. So one of the things I did, playing with the town's money, was I said,
better than your
okay,
own.
okay, that's the people that are gonna put in ADUs, you're gonna pay for the whole thing. But we'll give you a tax holiday for 10 years on that additional assessed value. The number 254 are also likely to be full-time residents, because we did the math on that too, so they can get the $18,000 tax credit. So for relatively short money, yeah, they gotta pay for the thing, but you get an ADU.
Why would you get a tax credit on the value instead of the cost?
Because you get value on what the assessment is based on, ADUs actually add a lot of value to a property beyond the cost.
No, I
Because
understand that, but
Yeah.
so why are you getting credit for a benefit instead of what you're paying out?
I think it is on the payment, isn't it? The 18K is on what you spend.
18K is a 4-year credit.
No, I understand.
On the construction.
No, but you're saying you're getting a $22,000 tax credit.
But that's over 10 years. I'm
Town.
saying you get 22.
Town.
Yeah, the town. I'm saying the
Town
town
tax.
as an incentive to get you to put in, yeah, you give up some money, but you just did 2 things. You added housing.
I understand all that, but your
Okay.
credit is based on, what I understand you said, was on the value of the increased
The
value of the
assessed
property.
value, yes, the increased assessed value. 250 increase in assessed
But are
value.
there other credits that work that way?
No.
Finance guy.
I just made it up. I told you I'm playing with it too.
So you're suggesting.
I'm looking at,
I'm saying typically you get a credit because you paid out money, right? Like the 18,000.
it's an incentive. Yeah, it's different. Yeah. But I would say, but the town's getting it back over time, because you are gonna get that money back. It's just gonna take time. So it's really a temporary loan, and you're gonna assume value continues to go up. In the meantime, we just created a housing unit. That's pretty valuable, I think, right?
Yeah,
So,
I see.
anyway, I'm just playing around here with ideas. Yes, play devil's advocate, please. So, of the roughly, there's about 1,737 homes in phase 3 in the watershed, the 3 bays watershed. There's more than that in the phase 3 number, but it's 1,737 based on this number in the watershed. So if 254 took ADUs, let's look at the 890. Still getting a state tax credit for that number of homes.
I'm sorry, what's the difference between the ADU number and the residential option number? I'm not picking up on
The
that.
ADU is just, if you're a full-time resident, you can take
Yep.
$18,000.
So what's the next column represent?
The
that's
next column
differentiated?
is what's left over, so 1,737 total homes.
Right.
The top line is treating each one of those cohorts differently. So the second, I call the residential option, people that
no
are
ADU,
full-time
the second
residents.
Okay, so that's just pure, regular,
Yeah.
regular home.
Okay, full-time residents, and they earn enough money. About 61% of the people in town are full-time residents in the phase 3 area. About 61%, they're both within a fraction, with 61.4, 61.3, earn $111,000, okay? So enough to take advantage of the full $18,000.
And you can get some, if you earn less than that, you still get some of the 18.
Yeah,
It's
we're gonna
prorated.
get to that, So this group gets a state tax credit, town subsidy, 21,000 bucks in this case.
But that's not a tax credit
That's like,
subsidy,
no, that's not
actual.
tax, that's like, we gotta go fund it. Gotta fund it out of taxes,
Okay.
probably can't fund it out of SRF based on what we're saying. Gotta write a check, okay? It's about 19 million bucks in that particular cohort. The next category, and so we're saying the homeowner is responsible for 6578. Why did I pick that number? I picked that number because it's 14.5% of the total, which is the same math for the sewer. 20,000 bucks of 140 is also 14.5%. It could be different. Scott said, well, why shouldn't they pay the same 20,000 bucks? I don't know, maybe they should. I'm just playing around with numbers, okay? Just trying to think differently about how you might think of this big picture. So then the next category is non-residents. It's hard to see on that screen.
Yeah.
So 285 of those households, non-resident, they gotta write a bigger check. Just about equal probably to what a Title V, a new Title V would probably cost you 16 to 20,000 bucks. And then town or county funding assistance, what do I mean by that? I mean, maybe we go and make a deal with a bank that will help you with funding. You gotta pay for it, you're on the hook, it's on your dime, we're not paying for it, but we might find a way to help with the funding.
So in that green, sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I get my head wrapped around it.
Yeah.
So that green column there for town or county, can that be, I don't know, the magnitude of work, is that like the no interest loan type thing? So it's not actually a check to you, it's the fact that you get a 0% loan, so there's savings value because you're not paying interest on the loan. Is that what that is?
Yeah, that's what that is, and it's really hard because, I don't know, they're non-residents, they still pay taxes, what benefits do they get, how do we figure
Yeah.
out what's fairness? Fairness is gonna be very difficult in this conversation, needless to say, okay? Ron?
Why'd you make that distinction between, resident households?
Because non-residents don't get the
Non-residents.
$18,000 tax credit.
You have to be a primary resident to get the tax
You gotta be a
credit.
full-time resident to get the
State.
tax credit. That's all, I'm just
Okay.
making up different
Okay.
buckets.
All right.
So the distinction's already
I
been
gotta
made,
just
we're
put it
just
in
working with the distinction that's already been made.
Yeah, okay.
Can I just say, one thing that I find really attractive of the tax credit, it's really the only thing that's money coming into the town from someplace else. Everything else is recycled town money. Homeowner taxes, SRF, gotta pay it back. Even the Cape and Islands is recycled rental income, right? So all that stuff is just money moving around. That's money that's coming directly from off Cape, out of town. That's just my simple look, that's why I find it attractive to take. And so part of the discussion we've been having is how do we optimize getting as much of that tax credit money as possible? Because that's probably the only free money here, if I can describe it that way.
So then the final category is low income. I just took the county numbers, you know, the number of people low income is extraordinarily high. So this is based on anybody who's earning less, and I know it's a sliding scale based on how many members of the family, it's very complicated. Anybody who earns less than $75,000 here is what I'm categorizing as low income. And I'm saying the town pays for the whole thing, and we're gonna find the money. Now, overly generous, in fact, some of those people are gonna be able to get some money back from the state tax credit because it's not a zero-sum situation.
Right.
You can get some, you just can't get the full $18,000. And certainly some people ought to pay something, and I don't know how to do it. But I just put that in there, and I put that in there because if you take the subsidy of the 890 houses, which is I think 19, I'll get some of the math wrong, and you do the full subsidy for the 300 houses, which is another roughly 15 million bucks, you get to a number that's still like 35 million versus 210 million for sewer, okay, for the town alone, because it would be higher than that if you included the $20,000 that the homeowner is paying as part of the sewer program. So that's how I get to saving 175 million bucks. And that's why I say if we can do that, you know, we're still a town in good enough financial shape that we might be able to afford some version of this and have an opportunity to save a lot of money.
So one thing that needs to be acknowledged here is that the conversation ultimately is not purely a financial one. You know, whether, I'm not quibbling on the numbers, wherever they are.
Yeah.
It's stuff that, so when you start looking, you know, for instance, what we just had with the whole freshwater pond aspect in phase 3.
Yeah.
You know, there's other things that are going to drive some of the solutions. And then on top of that, at the end of the day, we've got to still make the regulatory thing work. And the modeling's got to make the regulatory thing work. So I don't know if it's necessarily, I guess what I want to caveat this with, for particularly for the folks watching at home, is that it's not necessarily a one-for-one swap out. You know,
No.
This just provides construct to have a conversation, which I think is a positive thing to do. But there's going to be aspects of phase 3 that we're going to probably have to hang on to for reasons not necessarily financial, not necessarily. There's other things that drive some of that we're going to want to talk about. And then at some point, we're going to have to talk about, you know, future, for lack of a better term, future pollutants and how we deal with that and that kind of thing. So that's there. But just for people watching it, I don't.
Yes.
Yeah, CECs, microplastics, PFAS. What I don't want to do is, I don't want the soundbite coming out of this going, oh, you can just get rid of phase 3, save $105 million if you do this. It's more complicated.
It's way
This is useful for a conversation starter.
Yeah.
And
But
look,
that's what this is.
you know, let's just think about ADUs, for instance, okay? I just added a lot of bedrooms, okay? So, fact of the matter is, roughly, in rough terms, you know, this particular system that we use for your 3-bedroom house that existed, you reduce everything by 95%. You add a bedroom, it's still an 80-something% reduction, but it's not as much. So you've got to do more. You got to figure out, okay, we just change things, so the whole model changes, and I get that. So, and that goes across the board on this, but I'm doing it because we need to think about it and think about what mechanisms can we pull to make this
You're
more
gonna
treatable.
change that slide? No.
Go ahead.
So, but an ADU is more than just a bedroom, right?
Yeah.
Of course.
You're not just saying, by adding a bedroom, you're getting $250,000 worth of value.
No, it's an AD, it's a separate
It's a part-
structure.
part-
It's a separate structure, which we don't know what the rules are yet, right? I talked to our
Right.
local guy, I mean, I don't know what the rules are gonna be. The state's saying everybody can do it. I don't know what the rules are gonna be. There's gonna be some rules. In fact, one of the interesting things that the developer of this particular system is doing is he's recirculating from the septic tank in such a way that you should be able to add that ADU in, treat everything within one tank, and get really stellar performance. So we'll see. But go ahead, Dan.
Okay, so I'm gonna revisit my drum banging. What I'd like to see is you acknowledge and include life cycle costs in this analysis. And you've heard me say this for a year, that you are going to replace a septic system at least once. You know, a sewer system is gonna last longer than a septic system.
I say I don't agree with you, but I understand you think that. but I don't have.
In about 100 years of wastewater expertise.
What's the life of a septic tank? It's
Septic system.
concrete, no, a septic tank, a
We don't
tank.
get to reuse septic tanks. We're not doing it.
Yes, we do, I'm reusing them right in Schubel. I'm reusing the tanks. 60% of the houses, I'm reusing the tanks.
But you're down the road, you're gonna have to replace that
I
system.
don't know when though, concrete lasts a
You
long time.
can't ignore it.
No,
Can we-
I believe that
can we-
concrete
can we
lasts a
agree on
long
that?
time. I'm
You
not
can't ignore
ignoring it, but I don't believe that it's a 25-year swap out. The failure point of Title V systems is the leaching field, 100%. That's the failure point. So if we've got a system that's delivering practically potable water, and I would argue it's very close to potable water, and I'm gonna illustrate that in a minute, then I don't think we have the failure point that would cause the kind of O&M number that I think you're talking about. I don't think it's gonna happen like that, because I'm gonna take all the components of the tank I just showed you, wood chips, limestones in 50, 70 years, I'm gonna swap all that stuff out. Some of the tubing's gonna have to be changed. It's set up so you can change everything, but the concrete. Now, I think the concrete can be made to last a long freaking time.
So,
I
but
don't know,
even
80 years.
But even if you keep the concrete though, the swap out itself, there's value to some of what you said at any rate. The value, the cost to swap out tubing, the cost to swap out stuff. So there is a cost there to do that. Now, the disagreement is just what's the extent of that cost.
And that's why I'm not convinced, that I haven't seen the numbers.
shouldn't
You don't
carry
know the
zero.
numbers to see whether, it's not gonna be zero. We're not counting it as zero. But I'm not counting the municipal treatment as zero either, right? I mean, there's a cost there, right?
I've actually been talking with John
The
Smith.
treatment plant. The
The
ongoing
users are paying for
O&M
that.
for your system is non-trivial as well, right?
The users are paying for that.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think of them as probably being close to the same. I could be wrong, but that's the way I think about them.
Okay.
I've been talking with John Smith about this, and I remember you mentioned this a while back, Dan. I've been playing around with how do we actually realistically calculate the life cycle cost? I would be interested in maybe talking with you guys at some time, because and I've been talking with Anastasia Budinko with GHD about this too, because she's working on Wellesley with me. We've been talking about that, and one of the things we were talking about, how long does a concrete tank last? Or how long should we assume a concrete tank at the treatment plant lasts? So because if we're ultimately gonna try to compare, it'd be nice to use the same numbers for some of these things. Now, I know there's very different
Yeah, but they're
facilities.
structurally, I mean, I understand your thinking there, but I
Pumps,
don't.
piping, concrete, wood chips we got, limestone we got, the pumps, that's relatively easy. I have that data from John, his estimates on it. What I don't know is how long a concrete tank, what lifespan, the PVC piping, things like that. And we can do that, but we need to know what are the right numbers to use. So I'd love to get with you on that so we can do it in a way that meets standard engineering assumptions about concrete. Because to Z's point, I mean, there's a lot of septic tanks in the Cape that are well over 50 years old.
There's cesspools in the Cape that are well over 50 years old.
What's that?
There's cesspools in the Cape.
Yeah, exactly. So it lasts a long time, but I don't know what the right numbers are, so.
Yeah, I mean, leaching systems are usually the point of failure of a septic system,
Right.
right? So,
And I'm not trivializing the O&M. The O&M is something that's really gotta be looked at, okay? It's part of,
I don't know if that's an O&M cost that we're talking about, though, it's just a repeating capital cost.
Right.
So the O&M cost, to me, that's a whole different conversation, it's O&M.
It is.
But I think, and correct me if I'm misstating your position, is that it's the reoccurring capital cost. And when that reoccurring capital cost, is there a reoccurring capital cost within the 50-year lifespan of a plant or 20-year lifespan of a thing? And then when is that coming?
Yeah.
And what is the value of that? I think that conversation is, from where we've sat and we've watched these presentations before, that's never been addressed in there. And so to make this a more robust conversation as to that, at some point we need to, it may not be 100%, it may not be times 2 at 20 years, I'll acquiesce to that. But there is some sort of reoccurring capital cost at some point in time, because these things don't live forever, traditionally.
And we've looked at it, and Bruce has looked at it through
Based
time.
on Dan's input to a presentation I made a year ago, we went back and asked the question, what are the replacement costs that we have to track? And those are part of the cost basis or cost analysis that I submitted last winter.
But that's a real thing that needs to be spent, we gotta spend time on it. I don't
That's a good question.
disagree at all.
A slightly different question. In an IA system, will the leach field last any longer?
Well,
That's
yeah,
the
let's, you know,
I don't think it's been proven, but that's the hypothesis.
I mean,
So
yes.
that reduces the cost.
Potentially.
Not only last longer, but I was saying before, probably
yes.
reduce the size as well.
We're gonna
But
talk
does that,
about,
but did that then, will be an interesting conversation
It's
is,
not gonna do both.
does does it do both or does one defeat the
Yeah.
other? Like if you reduce the size, you're back to your original lifespan,
Right,
whereas if you
yes.
keep the size, you
Right.
double your lifespan. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's a,
Brian Baumgartel, I think, just submitted a report to DEP on exactly this issue. They have a site they've been doing. Do you know about that, Tom? They've been doing a site over there,
George did a
loading
big
it.
presentation in Springfield a couple of months ago on it,
Yeah.
that I spoke at. I mean, so the numbers actually look like you could go back to a leaching pit that's quite small and it would last almost forever because you're basically putting water in it. It's really water. So it doesn't clog up. But hey, a lot of work needs to be done to prove that out. I'm not taking that as the gospel. I'm just saying that work is being done. It's gonna take a while. DEP hasn't signed off on it, so we'll see. But
So leach fields, one of the things is like disinfection, bacterial and all that.
Right.
Have you looked at that in your system?
yeah, and that's why it clogs up. And George has done a lot of that work.
Yeah.
George and Brian. This is the ADU map, just to give you an idea. This is everybody that could get an ADU. So it was a lot of ADUs potentially, and based on the math that I used. Okay. And that's a lot more than 500. That's the whole watershed. So CECs, and this is taking again a page from George, looking at some different CECs with a drip system. Okay, so this is rather than dropping it into your tank, you're putting it into a drip system in a shallow field. This is George's numbers, not mine. But I asked him, because I said, so how do we compare a regular municipal system with a lot of these CECs to the potential for some of these IA systems? Which may require some tweaking, but the numbers are still pretty interesting. So, I'm not saying this is the gospel either, but they're George's numbers, not mine. This is from Mass Tech, this is from the work that George is doing.
Can you explain this, at least for?
I don't get it. Percent removal of those compounds, is that what you're showing?
Yeah. Conventional activated sludge, that would be a typical municipal treatment plant, okay? So a drip system, take the top thing, acetaminophen, you know what that is, okay? So you can just take that 99, okay? And conventional sludge also gets a big number, but some of these other things, not so much. So, you know, the idea that you're not getting anything potentially from the IAs is not correct, probably. Do you need to do a lot more work? Absolutely. PFAS is a whole separate kettle of fish and conversation. You know, but kind of our mantra as a nonprofit has always been, let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. We're not gonna reduce everything to zero going into the ground, there's no way. But if we can get systems that can do a lot, that we can actually afford. To me, that's one of the key things here is, what can we actually afford to do over time? It'd be great to put in everything we wanted to, but I'm not sure we can afford it. So that was just a slide on CECs. This is another slide out of George's presentation. Could you just shrink the space? This is what we're talking about here. So the cost savings, if you could shrink the space by 70%, which is what he's been doing at the joint base, it's a big chunk of money. So one of the things I continue to think about when I think about the IA systems is, you know, we're working with one guy who makes a few of them. A lady at EPA said, it's an artisanal business. It's like baking bread. You're making just a few of them. It's pain d'Avignon. It's not Wonder Bread, right? But to really solve the problems in this community and across the peninsula, we need Wonder Bread. We need scale production. Until we get that, we really don't have anything. And we talked about all the different things that have to go into scale because there's a lot of regulatory and real world questions that we need to answer before we're ready for this. And this is one of them though, because I think there are levers to reduce costs. Manufacturing at greater scale is gonna reduce cost. If we can prove that we can shrink the leaching field substantially, we can save a lot of cost. We were in a meeting earlier, one of the things that interests me about the EIA systems is just about 10% of the $46,000 is engineering costs. And yet, we're almost always replacing or adding on to an existing Title V system. And yet still, the engineer is like, oh, that's $5,000. I'm like, why?
For
Why
every
is that number
single
$5,000? It's
installation.
crazy. So I do think there's ways to optimize and save
So
money.
just to highlight that, one of the other discussions we've had in Wellfleet, with the health regulation that they're considering, part of it is real estate transfers. And they're thinking about giving the homeowner like a year to actually implement. And the idea would be they could batch, we might get 30, 50, or 100 of these. And then they go out to bid. Peel and Bardo was actually the guy that came up with this idea. Then you have one engineer bid, 50 of these, and it becomes a lot more cost effective rather than each homeowner, which is what the existing $46,000 number includes each homeowner going out and getting each own engineer. It includes engineering. I think about 4,000. So if we could get that, down, that would save.
That makes sense.
So let's look at challenges. This is not meant to be a complete list, and there's a lot of challenges, okay? Commercial availability, lack of multiple suppliers, we don't have lots of suppliers. We tested Mass Tech's own non-proprietary system at Schubel, and it got quickly overwhelmed by a water flow that's only slightly outside 110 gallons per day per bedroom, okay? A flow of 350 has crushed the system. Doesn't work, as far as I'm concerned. The system that we're using actually is robust enough that it's handling huge flow and still performing at amazingly strong levels. So we've got RME, we've got full regulatory stuff, we've got the costs, we've got trained personnel needs, we've got betterment. What do you really do with that? The maintenance costs and power, see, I didn't ignore it, Dan, you just didn't see that on the bullet point. Flow versus load, Rob, you brought that up a lot, because I think it's critical. Zoning implications, critical. We gotta figure out how we're gonna treat these things. The plan to work with existing infrastructure is coming in. Are you really gonna say, yeah, sewer's coming in 7 years, your system failed, you gotta put this in 5, but we're gonna rip the frickin' thing out and make you hook up to sewer, and how do we deal with that? Gotta figure that. These are complicated questions, right?
So let me speak to some of that real quick. So for the committee thing, there's sort of two mandates for this committee. One is the helping us rewrite the CWMP update, which is, conversations about how we want to do things for that. The second is within either the time it has left or as we encounter them going forward, is sort of teeing up policy discussions for the council level. Because some of these things don't get decided here, they get decided at the council level.
Or Board of Health.
Or Board of Health. But my point to this is that as we run into things like that, we should be bucketing them somewhere to then have a probably conversation with town council about how they want that, do you want a white paper, do you want a presentation? How does town council want to digest a recommendation from the committee on a policy decision that they then can then go chew on? So some of that stuff, the 5 years, if there's 7 years out, those kinds of conversations, we should chew up.
Pose the questions, right? And
Yeah.
give them.
So we're not gonna decide those here because none of us have the authority to do so here in the jurisdiction to do so. What we do is tee that stuff up as a almost laundry list ultimately of policy conversations to be had with town council to say, here are things, because they're not bumping into it. You're gonna bump into it as we're going through these conversations.
Yep.
Here are things that need to be chewed on and discussed and ultimately,
Yep.
it's to them as the elected officials to decide, are you doing 7 year, 5 year, what's the cutoff there? That kind of stuff.
See, where are we at in the presentation? Because one of my jobs here is time management.
I'm almost done. Opportunities, low cost, rapid installation, targeted locations, recharge stays local, betterment opportunities, townwide implications, workforce job creation, I think that's non-trivial. That's it, the summary, we should do this, we should do it quickly, time to travel, you guys can read it, that's it, I'm done. How about that?
And the voice held out the entire time.
So I just want to reserve a little time for discussion of future meetings, because we gotta get these lined up, and I've been making some notes here.
Scott, I have a question first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is your PowerPoint gonna be available to the public?
Sure. I mean, it's here, Chris has it.
On the,
Oh, yeah, I was about to ask you if you can send it to me, but then I'm
100%.
like, hey, dummy, you already got it sent to me.
Yeah, no, I gave it
Post
to
it
you.
on
You can have it.
the
Yeah,
That's no
website.
problem.
I'll post
And
it.
same thing with, I have these papers, we can put them on a town website if you want, whatever,
I was gonna ask for that, if you can
Whatever.
send me the.
Yeah, I'll send you those.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
are you gonna have questions from like folks that may come? I don't know if that's something.
Yeah,
you've
no,
thought about.
absolutely. Questions? You guys?
This is a question I have. This looks like a long-term project. The guys in the first 10 years, this is just not possible. You're gonna hook up, period. If it's an IA later on, then tough luck, you're on the sewer. Is that you're looking really longer term in this? This is not a 10-year project. This is something 20 or 30 years down the road.
Well, I think we're focusing this primarily in phase 3, which is out, 10 or 20 years, although I think there's certainly some discussion to suggest we could start using these in some areas, like tomorrow, if we decide to do it. What's that?
areas that will never get sewered.
Right.
Or
Right.
are not
Right.
scheduled.
Which, and Rob said, something you've said a couple times is, this model, the MEP model, when it was done 20 years ago, it was the best thing out there, but even then, all models were wrong, some are helpful. We don't know how accurate this is, and you've said a number of times, we may need more than the plan. Things are warming up. The heat, the climate change heat was not in the MEP model.
There's been places built since that model happened.
So we may need more,
So I mean, I've always looked at the CWMP as sort of the minimum that we need to do.
Right.
And now the conversation is, given the tools that are now available to us that weren't available to us 5 years ago.
Yeah.
How do we employ those tools to do more? And then as we learn things about those, and do not this conversation, but do what we're hoping to do along the Marshall's Mills River and do that other stuff. How does that affect the overall estuary, and thus in phase 3 be a different conversation?
One of the things that I didn't talk about when I talk about it in my newsletter, if you think, we targeted phase 3 here. Back to Dan, your point, I mean, septic systems fail. In fact, they fail a lot. So the average house built in phase 3 was built in 1977. So we're gonna replace almost all those things by the time the sewer even gets there. And so that's why, to me, looking at this model, we can get at that stuff earlier. A lot of it's in less than 10-year travel time, so we can actually hit it and impact, the water we're trying to protect faster. So there's, every reason to look at that and say, if we can move on this, sooner, then we can get people to transition, as these things fail, because they're failing all the time.
I think there's a real interesting conversation to be had at the table about, because I can see a couple different ways you could do that. You could say, all white spaces, period, the end, you're just not allowed to put back a Title V. You could say, only nitrogen-sensitive watersheds, you're not allowed to put back a Title V. If yours either dies, the natural milestones that you reach on those things. You could say, within so many feet of the water body, you're not allowed to put in a Title V. So I think that's part of the conversation that's gonna have to happen, and obviously it goes as a recommendation to town council to think about. But that's kind of what, I don't doubt the technology at this point, it's just, how do we employ it? What's the right way to employ it, where do we employ it? And there's the sort of, our perspective on it, who's real close to the issues with it, and then there's the perspective of Mrs. McGillicuddy, who's not paying attention to this, and what are they thinking about that?
This is a stupid question, maybe, but do we have that authority at the town level to really strengthen those requirements without any kind of obligation to the state in terms of?
The Board of Health has the ability, so when we did this 5 years ago, we talked to Board of Health at the time, and what their perspective was is that if they would not mandate a system unless it was generally approved by the state, which is what stopped the conversation during the last update. Now, thanks to and I can't overstate this enough, Z's Group's just done a lion's share of this work and deserves a huge amount of credit to doing that. Because of the work they've done, we're now you know, as you've heard tonight, about a year away from actually having a generally approved system. So you now actually have a tool in the toolbox, and now whether the state approves it at 10, 5, 2, or 20, I don't know. We'll find out.
What
But
do you mean a 10, 5, 2, or 20?
in terms of an effluent limit,
Oh.
what they're willing to credit it as.
Oh, okay.
And I'm gonna jump in on that, finish.
Yeah.
So, to me, once we have that, then there's, from previous discussions of Board of Health, and that was a chair that's now left, so we'll see.
Right.
And one of the things we'll need to do as this committee is
Right.
have the Board of Health come in and actually have a conversation with you guys about what they're willing and not willing to do. But they will, you know, they have the authority to do that. Now, whether they have the willingness to do, that's a whole different conversation.
Okay. So Rob, I just want to mention, because you mentioned credit, on the approval letters from DEP, there is a number, 10, 11, 25. But I've asked Drew Osei, who's the DEP guy in charge of all this, at least 5 times. And the answer is, in a watershed permit, the credit is not the approval letter, it's the monitoring data. So in other words, we're gonna be testing these. The Pleasant Bay plan says you take approximately once per year each system. It's actually 10% each month, which comes out about the same. We look at that data set, which would be done by the RME, which might be Mass Tech at this point, or the town. And then we submit that data, like the data that Z showed here. And if the average number is 6.2, then that's the credit we get. So in other words,
Our watershed permit doesn't include these.
right, but it could be on an amended basis.
Right, I don't know,
Going
but I think
forward.
there's a discussion there too, is that are we better off having these built into the watershed permit? Are we better off doing these as a community because we believe in them? You know, and then the watershed permit ride as it is.
Yeah.
Because that's already pretty much on its way to being done. So then you're not, then you have more, I would argue, you have more freedom then with these systems.
Right.
At that point in time, because now the community, as I understand it, and I've not heard anything from DEP that says otherwise, they can do more.
Yeah, yeah.
If the community decides that it wants to do more of something,
That's the case, yeah.
you know, then they can do that, and that's not as constrained.
Interestingly, Tisbury's a great case there. They don't have a watershed permit. They've been doing this for 3 years. They have a health regulation for 3 years doing this. No, they did it for this crazy idea. We want to clean up the water.
Yeah, and I think that's.
About the permit, we just
And
want to
I
clean up the water.
would argue, though I'm just a voice at the table, that I would argue that's kind of the approach we need to be thinking about this as.
So the Board of Health is the.
Yeah.
They have the ability to
do it.
That's where it happens, okay.
So let me, I just want to, I got some notes here about future meetings, and it comes back to scheduling the next
Yeah.
meeting for you.
Yeah,
You
not for
mentioned-
me, but for Scott.
You mentioned, Rob, we might have discussion on more than one meeting on IAs because they're likely big components. So I guess my question to the group is, do we want to schedule continue this conversation with more detail in January, or do we want to move to the growth control issue and then come back to this later, maybe?
Can I make
Yeah.
why don't we combine them in the next meeting? Why
Two
can't we
items?
cover both topics?
Because we may not need the whole thing for
Exactly.
Okay. Okay.
That's
Well,
where I would.
that gets me to my other note. I wrote down ADU again. I think I mentioned at the first meeting, I think there's a new law coming in place this spring in the state, which in the town has passed their own ADU local law, but there's a new law coming at the state level that I don't know much about. I think if we're gonna talk about these things, it would be good to learn about that, so I'm still looking for somebody to speak on that issue, and I don't know who that is. Maybe the new town planner?
Yeah, that's what you'd want to get.
So-
You'd get Jim, we'd invite Jim to come in and talk.
So I don't wanna overcrowd the agenda, but if we are gonna be talking about growth, and does that go well with it, do you think, the ADU discussion?
The only thing I'm concerned about is just time, because my hope is that the group, one of the reasons we moved into here from the dais was to just facilitate better communication
Yeah.
and more free-flowing communication, but that takes time. You know, so if we put too much stuff in any one meeting, do we basically stifle communication because you don't have time to get through it all?
So how about, let me make this suggestion then, if you think we can get the town planner, why don't we keep the growth stuff on for the next meeting with Andrew, yourself, and then we can ask the town planner?
February.
Because that all fits together nicely. If we have time, we can return to the IA discussion. If not, we'll do it the next meeting.
Yeah, we're coming, there's no doubt we're coming back to the IA
Yeah,
discussion, because,
yeah.
I mean, this was just to say, this is what they can do, now we have to decide, do we wanna use them, where do we wanna use them, how do we wanna use them?
So who would check with the town planner and see if we can get them?
I've already talked to him, it's just ultimately, we have to check the night that we just set, but
Okay.
he is aware that he was gonna be.
So February
Called.
timeframe?
I'm sorry?
The February
Yeah.
meeting for him?
I'm thinking we do it with the growth control.
Oh, you wanna put them all together?
Because that kind of, because Rob's suggesting that may not take the whole meeting.
Okay.
But I think the ADU discussion is a nice complement to that.
So Scott, what do you want Jim addressing
I think
in his presentation?
what I'd like is both the new state law, and I'd like to get more clarification on the town bylaw. It was, what, a year or two ago that came into place?
Longer than
What does all that mean in terms of, what Z's talking about, future areas, can we, I like the idea of combining affordable housing with this, right? We're putting technology in, which is usually the limitation on a lot of these affordable projects, so let's take advantage of that. So I'd say both town bylaw and the new.
So specifically talking about the ADUs.
ADUs,
The
yeah, I
state
think
law
so.
and the local.
And I think it would be good to have the planner here, he or she's name, I don't.
Jim Cupford.
Because he's gonna be interested in this discussion too, right? The growth associated with the 0% financing. So it goes together well, I think.
And he's currently developing the local comprehensive plan, and I don't know how the feedback loop into that from this is, but it's at least good for him to be aware what this group is talking about.
All right, so let's plan on that being the next discussion. And it's, again, Chris, just to get the time and date right, we'll send it out, but it's the 28th at 6 p.m.
Yes, January 28th.
6 p.m.
For this new state ADU regulation, does anyone know if it's gonna supersede ours, or will it?
We were just asking that same question.
Okay.
It will, the town planner is speaking to I think it's gonna be sent to the planning board, but it has to comply, bring the town's regs into compliance with the new state reg. But I
Okay.
also heard that there hasn't been a lot of public appetite for the ADUs because it's expensive to construct.
Right.
So it's not the hot item to do as someone wants, or as was expected, I guess.
Right.
That's what I've heard.
All
It's
right,
not
so
the
we
driver.
have matters not reasonably anticipated by the chair. Are there any?
Did any of the
Yes.
fellows
Oh.
need to speak?
Bruce?
No, I'm good.
Yep, Dan?
Something I knew you mentioned earlier, something I thought about on the SRF for septic systems basically and the IAs. So the county has their program,
Aquafund.
right? You know where that funding comes from? SRF.
Was it ARPA?
SRF.
It's us.
What is SRF? Okay.
Point of
That's all,
information.
yeah. And this goes back to what the tax credit legislation actually says and means, because I don't know who we're gonna get on that one, in terms of, I don't know who the expert on that one is.
Not me.
Come back to that later. All right, any other matters we haven't?
Well, actually, no, because we talked about, that would be, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm slow on the uptake. No, we'd probably get, at some point in time, we'll get Mark Milne in.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
and so we'll have, I don't know if that's February or March, but we're kind of framing up the meetings, but
Maybe we start thinking about the February meeting coming back on IA with that component.
so that would be the expert to speak to that kind of stuff.
Okay.
He would remote in, but,
Yeah.
but he'd be another one to talk.
I just point out that I'm counting on my fingers. We have 7 more meetings before we have to come up with a final plan to deliver to town council.
7 more, is that right?
Well, you have 7 more months.
Yeah, 7 more
Right,
months.
we are really at the discretion of the committee to meet however often you guys feel is needed. If you wanna make it weekly, you wanna meet monthly, whatever, obviously we have to readjust schedules, but yeah, it's 7 months, but not 7 meetings.
Well, maybe at the next meeting, we should come, you had provided, Rob, a list of potential subjects. Maybe we should revisit that. Let's put that on the agenda for the next meeting, and at the end of it, revisit the longer list, so we can start, Brian and I can start scoping that out in terms of a plan.
And just for the committee's knowledge, so one of the things so this report, this update report, it's obviously kind of one of the first there's parts of it that are perfunctory in my mind that are, so what did you do for the last 5 years, that stuff. Kelly comes back, so those who don't know, Kelly Colopy's been out on maternity leave, she comes back this Wednesday. So she'll be starting to work on the other parts, not new parts to that thing. So it's not like we have to sit down as a committee and get that all written out. That stuff's gonna get written. The part that you guys are really sort of chewing on is what's gonna change, what's new, what are the new recommendations. So it won't necessarily be the whole kit and caboodle's gotta be written by August. I'm hoping that we're gonna have some draft of that by early summer anyways, that can be then digested and looked at by the committee, et cetera, that says, this is what we did the last 5 years, this is the project that's been done, here's how the plans evolved, et cetera, et cetera.
Let me also, go ahead,
I'm
Chris.
also thinking, do you wanna consider maybe, making a short list to bring to the town council and not necessarily dump everything all at once, because going into August, you got budget season, April, May, June. So maybe you wanna send something to the council, well, it's not, how do I wanna say, in the calendar year, it's not, already scheduled with things to do. So I'm saying, bring something.
What would be the deadline or timeframe to do that
To send some, what do you mean?
to the town council?
We have an agenda setting meeting once a week usually.
Okay, all right, let's think about that.
But I'm just saying that maybe you can send 2, 3, 4 recommendations with a presentation and say more coming down the line. So it's not.
Or interim things, are we talking about giving them an update before we finish all our work, is that kind of what you're
An
suggesting?
update or come out of this with some recommendations. If it's 400 feet away from water's edge that you think is a good idea, actually that would probably be sent to the Board of Health. You know, get something in the pipeline for one of the regulatory bodies to work on, because you dump a big load on and I think it's gonna own the agenda and nothing else will come through.
Okay.
But Chris, when you mentioned the fiscal year and the funding meetings, do you expect there to be something we come up with that would demand some funding from
No, that's not
motions?
what I was driving at is, when it comes to budget meetings, there's not much more room on the agenda. We've been as late as 1 a.m.
Yeah, I've seen those.
Yeah, so I'm just saying that.
Yeah, basically April to June is,
That's not a good time
Yeah.
to bring in a big project to mull over and have a
So
discussion.
the intent has been to, and the reason why Brian came up with 7 months, in the back of our heads as we've been talking about, is that if we could as a committee be done by the end of August and come to you guys in September with the recommendation, that gives you September, October, November to bless or not bless it, because then it goes into DEP in December, right? So it's due to DEP December, well, a year from now. You know, so that's kind of what the thinking has been, that if we get to you guys by September
Or
with,
Board of Health.
right, but Board of Health will get along the way. You know, by the time it comes to you, we'll have already baked whatever that cake is with the Board of Health. And it'll come, this is what the new plan is, you guys then have a couple of months to digest it. Does that not seem adequate? Is that?
No, I think that's fine. I'm just saying that I've had to learn that in the calendar year, more experienced than when I became a counselor, that I learned that budget season is not a good time to take on a weighty project.
Yeah.
So do it beforehand or after, but I'm saying, but maybe not dump it all at once, but do it in stages. So it'll get good airplay with the public.
You know, another thought there too, and this would be up to the council, is that, you know, we did those workshops last spring, which I thought were pretty effective.
They were.
You know, do we in August timeframe or July timeframe, when you're only doing one a month anyways, do we do a workshop there with the committee coming in and talk about it, not necessarily the final product, but at least to say, this is where we're thinking we're going. And just another thought for you to talk about with you know, you are leadership now, but to talk through and sort of, I don't know if that's an easier way to digest it.
Sure.
The only other thought I'm having is for those people who are not that familiar with this EIA technology stuff, the Mass Tech website's pretty good, right? They have more than just the data, they have descriptions of these systems, so it's pretty user-friendly. So Massachusetts Septic System Test Center, so it's a place I would suggest to go to, and also on the town website, there's a pretty good post.
Chris has got a lot of that stuff that he
Yeah.
pulls over to his website.
So that's another optional homework thing. If this was really new to you, the whole EIA, there's a lot to read about, and it probably will be a significant part of what we come out with, I think, in terms of. So it'd be good if everybody can get up to speed on. And if you still can't figure out, just call Z and he'll
You have to go through
give
this
you a
again.
private seminar.
Now, we're end of life in December, right?
For what?
End of life in December?
Currently, that's my understanding.
Yeah.
Well, not, end of life, yeah, end of life's a harsh way of saying that.
That wasn't in the job description.
I will
Signed up for, barely, yeah.
entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.